Imagine firing someone and thinking you'd never see them again, only to be shocked when they reappear 13 years later, completely transformed. That's exactly what happened to Jonathan, a ruthless millionaire who dismissed a woman without a second thought. But now, she's back. And what she does next will leave him speechless. Get ready for a story of unexpected revenge, redemption, and a twist that no one saw coming. It all began on a typical morning at Jonathan Smith's sleek, state-of-the-art. Jonathan was the epitome of success, a man who commanded attention the moment he entered any room. His crisp designer suits, the way he carried himself with unwavering confidence, and the aura of authority that surrounded him made him a figure many both admired and feared. Over the years, Jonathan had built a business empire from scratch, growing it into a multinational conglomerate worth billions. His work ethic was unmatched, his business acumen legendary, but one thing was clear: Jonathan valued results over people. In his world, only performance mattered. To those who worked for him, Jonathan was known as a cold, calculating boss, someone who had little time for emotions or personal stories. To him, every employee was a cog in the well-oiled machine of his company. If someone underperformed, he had no problem removing them and replacing them with someone more efficient. It was this mindset that led to the fateful decision 13 years ago, when Jonathan fired Sarah Thompson. Sarah, at the time, was a quiet, hard-working woman. She wasn't someone who drew much attention to herself, but she was dedicated and diligent. She had been working under Jonathan's leadership for a few years, putting in long hours and doing her best to meet the company's high standards. But during a particularly tough economic downturn, the company had to make cuts. Departments were being downsized, and performance reviews became ruthless. Sarah found herself on the wrong end of one of those reviews. To Jonathan, the decision to let her go was purely business. He didn't dwell on it, nor did he offer any comforting words. She was summoned to his office, where he coldly informed her that her position was being eliminated, effective immediately. Sarah, blindsided and heartbroken, could barely process what was happening. She had given everything to that job, and in a matter of minutes it was all taken away. Jonathan, however, barely noticed the sadness in her eyes as she left his office for the last time. To him, it was just another day, just another decision. As Sarah left the towering glass building that had once been her workplace, her mind was in turmoil. She had rent to pay, responsibilities to handle, and no idea how she would move forward. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of her life. She struggled to find work, and doors that once seemed open now felt firmly shut. But through the darkness of those days, a fire ignited within her. Sarah wasn't the type to give up easily. The memory of Jonathan dismissing her without a second thought, as if she were insignificant, became her motivation. She vowed to herself that she would rise above this, that one day she would prove to herself and to anyone who had ever doubted her that she was far more than just a disposable employee. Her journey over the next 13 years was anything but easy. Sarah took on multiple part-time jobs just to stay afloat, working as a waitress during the day and studying at night. She enrolled in business courses, determined to educate herself and find a new path. There were times when she doubted herself, when the weight of her circumstances seemed unbearable. But every time she felt like giving up, she remembered Jonathan's cold, indifferent face as he fired her. That memory fueled her drive. Slowly but surely, Sarah began to make progress. Her nights of studying paid off, and she earned qualifications that opened doors to new opportunities. She started working in a small firm, where her talent and work ethic didn't go unnoticed. As she climbed the corporate ladder, Sarah realized that she had a gift for strategy and business development. Her natural ability to see opportunities where others saw obstacles set her apart from her peers. Eventually, with years of experience under her belt, Sarah took the bold step of starting her own company. It wasn't easy at first. There were setbacks and moments of uncertainty, but she pressed forward. Her business began to grow, slowly but steadily. Word spread about her innovative approach, and soon she was competing with some of the biggest players in the industry. Sarah Thompson was no longer the woman Jonathan had dismissed all those years ago. She had transformed into a powerful, respected figure in her own right, running a successful business that was making waves in the market. While Sarah's star was rising, Jonathan continued his trajectory of success, completely oblivious to the impact he had made on her life. His company expanded into new markets, his wealth grew exponentially, and he became a regular at elite social gatherings. He was frequently featured in business magazines, hailed as one of the most influential businessmen of his time. But for all the outward success, there was something missing in Jonathan's life. The long hours, the relentless drive for more, left him feeling isolated. He had built his empire, but in doing so, he had neglected the personal connections that give life meaning. Jonathan didn't realize it, but he was trapped in a cycle of empty victories. Every deal closed, every new acquisition brought him a temporary sense of accomplishment, but it never lasted. Deep down, there was a void he couldn't fill, a sense that despite all his wealth and success, something was missing. Then came the invitation to the business summit. It was one of the most prestigious events in the industry, bringing together the biggest names from around the world. Jonathan, of course, was on the guest list. It was an opportunity to network, to make new deals, and to reaffirm his place at the top of the corporate world. But what he didn't know was that this summit would also bring someone from his past back into his life. Sarah received the same invitation. By now her business had grown to the point where she was considered one of the rising stars in the industry. She hadn't seen Jonathan in 13 years, but when she saw his name on the guest list, she knew it was time. Time to face the man who had once dismissed her as insignificant. Time to show him and herself just how far she had come. As the day of the summit approached, Sarah felt a mixture of anticipation and nerves. She wasn't seeking revenge, nor was she interested in confronting Jonathan with anger. She had long since moved past that stage. But this was her moment to stand tall, to walk into that room as his equal, or perhaps even more. She wasn't the same woman she had been 13 years ago, and she was ready to prove it. The summit was held in an opulent ballroom, filled with the elite of the business world. Expensive suits, designer dresses, and the buzz of important conversations filled the room. Jonathan arrived, as always, confident and self-assured. He mingled with ease, exchanging pleasantries and business talk with fellow executives. But he had no idea that across the room someone was watching him. When Sarah entered, heads turned. She carried herself with a quiet confidence, her presence commanding attention without the need for grand gestures. As she walked through the crowd, she spotted Jonathan. He was deep in conversation, laughing with a group of executives. The sight of him brought back memories of that day, but Sarah felt no anger, only a sense of calm. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, Jonathan's smile faltered. He recognized her instantly. But the woman standing before him now was nothing like the employee he had fired 13 years ago. This was a woman who exuded power, confidence, and success. Jonathan was momentarily stunned. He hadn't expected this. As the evening wore on, Sarah knew it was time to approach him. She didn't need a grand confrontation. Just a simple conversation would suffice. She walked up to him, and when he saw her standing in front of him, Jonathan's confidence wavered. "Sarah," he said, his voice betraying a hint of surprise, "it's been a long time." Now, before we continue with the rest of this incredible story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Trust me, you don't want to miss out. Here, you'll find the best stories on YouTube, stories full of twists, emotions, and surprises that you won't get anywhere else. So hit that subscribe button right now, because the next part is going to blow your mind. As Sarah and Jonathan stood face to face at the summit, the tension between them was palpable. For Jonathan, the shock of seeing Sarah in such a commanding position was still sinking in. He had spent years dismissing people who didn't meet his standards, believing that success was only for the strongest. But now, the woman he had once deemed insignificant was standing in front of him, her confidence unshakable. Sarah, on the other hand, had already come to terms with her past. Over the years, she had transformed that painful moment into the fuel that pushed her to rise above it. Now she had built a life and career that rivaled Jonathan's own empire, but being here, face to face with him, stirred memories she had buried deep. Her heart raced, but she maintained her calm, determined not to let the past dictate her present. Jonathan, ever the businessman, quickly shifted his demeanor. He had dealt with competitors, high-stakes negotiations, and hostile takeovers. A meeting with someone from his past couldn't faze him, or so he thought. But this was different. Sarah wasn't just another competitor or rival. She was a reminder of the mistakes he'd made along the way, mistakes he had never acknowledged, let alone addressed. "It really has been a long time," Jonathan finally said, trying to regain control of the conversation. "I heard about your company. You've made quite a name for yourself." Sarah gave him a polite smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you. It hasn't been easy, but I've worked hard for everything I've achieved." Jonathan nodded, sensing the weight behind her words. He didn't know the details, but he could imagine the challenges she must have faced after leaving his company. In his world, people were either strong enough to survive or they weren't. Clearly, Sarah had proven herself stronger than he'd ever anticipated. There was a moment of awkward silence before Jonathan, always seeking the upper hand, attempted to steer the conversation toward familiar territory. "So, what brings you here tonight? Expanding your business? Looking for new investors?" Sarah looked at him with the kind of poise that only comes from years of personal growth. "I'm not here for investors. I've been invited to speak about resilience and leadership. My company's doing quite well on its own." That response hit Jonathan harder than he expected. Here was a woman he had once fired, now standing on the same level as him, being asked to speak on leadership. Leadership, the very thing he had prided himself on mastering. He tried to brush off the discomfort creeping up on him, but it was undeniable. In the game of power, Sarah had become a formidable player. Before Jonathan could respond, another figure approached the pair, a familiar face from the business world. Mark Everett, a fellow CEO and one of Jonathan's longtime acquaintances, joined the conversation with a grin. "Jonathan, Sarah, didn't expect to see you two together." Jonathan forced a smile, but Sarah remained composed. She knew Mark well. In fact, they had crossed paths many times in the last few years, as her company had risen to prominence. Mark, like Jonathan, was a powerful figure, but unlike Jonathan, he had a reputation for fairness and respect in the way he conducted business. "Sarah and I were just catching up," Jonathan said, his tone casual, but there was a hint of unease. "I've been hearing a lot about the work she's been doing." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Catching up, huh? Well, I hope you two are having a productive chat. Sarah's been making waves lately. I've been following her company's growth. It's impressive. You must be proud of how far you've come, Sarah." Sarah smiled, but this time it was genuine. "Thank you, Mark. It's been a challenging journey, but I've had some good mentors along the way." Jonathan couldn't help but notice the subtle dig in Sarah's words. He had never been a mentor to her. If anything, he had been the obstacle she had to overcome. The conversation continued, with Mark and Sarah discussing various projects they were involved in. Jonathan stood there, feeling increasingly like an outsider in a room where he was supposed to be in control. As the night wore on, Jonathan found himself watching Sarah from a distance. She moved through the room with ease, engaging with influential figures, holding her own in every conversation. The more he observed, the more he realized that she was no longer the woman he had once dismissed. She had grown into a leader, someone who commanded respect without demanding it. And for the first time in a long while, Jonathan felt something unfamiliar: regret. The summit ended, but the thoughts that stirred within Jonathan didn't fade. He couldn't shake the image of Sarah standing confidently in front of him, speaking about resilience and leadership. As he drove home that night, his mind replayed the moment he had fired her. At the time, it had seemed like just another business decision, but now he wondered if it had been a mistake. Not just for her, but for him. Over the next few weeks, Jonathan found himself distracted. He continued running his business as usual, attending meetings, signing off on deals, and managing the day-to-day operations of his company. But Sarah's reappearance had unsettled him. He couldn't help but wonder how different things might have been if he had treated her differently all those years ago. Meanwhile, Sarah continued to thrive. Her company was expanding, and she had become a sought-after speaker at various business conferences. But Jonathan's reappearance in her life hadn't gone unnoticed either. While she had moved past the hurt of her dismissal, seeing him again had brought up old wounds. She wasn't interested in revenge. She had outgrown that desire long ago. But she couldn't deny that part of her wanted Jonathan to understand the impact his actions had had on her life. A few months later, Jonathan's company faced an unexpected challenge. A competitor, one he had underestimated, was rapidly gaining market share. For the first time in years, Jonathan found himself in a vulnerable position. His company, which had always been at the top, was now struggling to keep up. He needed a new strategy, a fresh perspective, and fast. That's when he thought of Sarah. It was a risk, and Jonathan knew it. Reaching out to someone he had wronged in the past wasn't something he was used to doing. But Sarah was a rising star in the business world, and her insights could be exactly what he needed to turn things around. After days of deliberation, Jonathan made the decision. He picked up the phone and dialed her number. When Sarah received the call, she was surprised. She hadn't expected to hear from Jonathan again, especially not in a professional context. There was a part of her that wanted to decline, to remind him of how he had dismissed her without a second thought. But Sarah wasn't the same person she had been back then. She had built her success on resilience and growth, and this was an opportunity to prove that she had truly moved beyond her past. She agreed to meet with Jonathan. The day of the meeting arrived, and as Sarah walked into Jonathan's office, memories of their last encounter in that very space came flooding back. But this time, she wasn't a vulnerable employee facing a cold, indifferent boss. She was a leader in her own right, with the power to choose how this story would end. Jonathan greeted her with a mixture of nervousness and respect. He knew he was asking for a lot, not just her insights, but her forgiveness as well. "Thank you for coming, Sarah," Jonathan said as he gestured for her to sit down. Sarah nodded, taking a seat across from him. "I have to admit, I was surprised to get your call." Jonathan sighed, his usually confident tone softened. "I know. I've been thinking a lot about the past, about the decisions I made, and I know I didn't treat you fairly back then." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "I've moved on, Jonathan. I built my career without your help, and I'm proud of what I've achieved. So why did you call me?" Jonathan hesitated, but then spoke with sincerity. "My company is in trouble. We're losing ground to a competitor, and I need fresh ideas. Your business has been thriving, and I thought maybe you could offer some advice." Sarah considered his words carefully. The younger version of herself might have jumped at the chance to show him up, to throw his desperation back in his face. But Sarah was no longer driven by ego. She had grown beyond that. "I'll help you," she said finally, "but not because I owe you anything. I'll do it because I believe in building people up, not tearing them down." Jonathan nodded, grateful. "I appreciate that, Sarah, more than you know." The meeting between Sarah and Jonathan marked the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. Though Sarah had agreed to help Jonathan, she did so on her own terms, knowing full well that this was no longer the dynamic of boss and employee. She was no longer the vulnerable woman seeking approval. She was now the one being sought out for her expertise. Yet, beneath the surface, emotions were brewing for both of them. This was not just about business anymore. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Jonathan met several times to discuss strategies for revitalizing his company. As they delved into the intricacies of the corporate world, Jonathan couldn't help but be impressed by Sarah's insights. She had a unique perspective, a sharpness that came from years of struggle and perseverance. Her strategies were bold, innovative, and exactly what his company needed to fight back against the competitor threatening to take his place. But the more time they spent together, the more their professional interactions began to reveal deeper undercurrents. Jonathan, for the first time in his life, began to confront emotions he had long suppressed. He had always prided himself on being a man of logic, a man who didn't let emotions cloud his judgment. But working with Sarah, seeing her strength, her determination, her ability to overcome adversity, stirred something inside him that he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just admiration, it was regret, mixed with an unfamiliar sense of longing. For Sarah, the experience was equally complex. Though she had moved on from the hurt of the past, being in such close proximity to Jonathan brought back memories she thought were long buried. She saw in him not just the cold businessman who had fired her, but a man who seemed to be wrestling with his own demons. She could sense his internal conflict, though he never spoke of it. But Sarah wasn't here to fix Jonathan. She was here to help his company, nothing more. Or at least, that's what she kept telling herself. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a crisp fall afternoon, and Sarah was in her office when she received an unexpected email. It was from one of Jonathan's competitors, the very one that had been gaining ground on his company for months. The email was brief but pointed. They wanted to meet with her. They were impressed with her work, her leadership, and they were offering her a position, a senior executive role with a compensation package that dwarfed anything Jonathan could offer. Sarah stared at the email for a long time, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. On one hand, this was a golden opportunity. The competitor was a rising star in the business world, and the chance to be part of that growth was tempting. But on the other hand, she had made a commitment to Jonathan. She had agreed to help him, and despite everything, she had come to respect him in ways she hadn't expected. The internal conflict gnawed at her. This wasn't just about money or career advancement. This was about integrity, about loyalty, about what kind of person she wanted to be. She could feel the pull in both directions. The competitor offered power, prestige, and financial security, but staying with Jonathan felt like the right thing to do, even if it wasn't the easiest path. That evening, as she sat at her desk, her phone rang. It was Jonathan. "I need to see you," he said, his voice tense. "Something's come up. Can you come to the office?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, still thinking about the email, but then agreed. "I'll be there in half an hour." When she arrived at Jonathan's office, she could immediately sense that something was wrong. Jonathan was pacing behind his desk, his usual calm demeanor replaced by visible frustration. Papers were scattered across the desk, and his face was etched with concern. "What's going on?" Sarah asked, stepping into the room. Jonathan stopped pacing and looked at her, his expression unreadable. "We're losing. The competitor. They're about to make a major acquisition that, if they succeed, it's over for us." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She knew this was serious, but hearing it from Jonathan's lips made it real in a way that she hadn't fully grasped before. She could see the weight of the situation bearing down on him, and for the first time she saw Jonathan not as the ruthless businessman she once knew, but as a man on the brink of losing everything he had worked for. "There's something else," Jonathan said, his voice dropping. "I've heard rumors. They're trying to poach some of my key people. They've already approached several executives, and now I've heard they're targeting you." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't told anyone about the email she received, and yet here was Jonathan, already aware of the competitor's intentions. She could see the question in his eyes, the unspoken fear that maybe, just maybe, she was considering leaving him for the very people threatening his company. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence in the room was heavy, filled with everything that wasn't being said. Sarah knew this was the turning point. She had a choice to make, and whichever path she chose would change everything. "I'm not leaving," Sarah finally said, her voice steady but soft. "I didn't come this far just to walk away now." Jonathan's shoulders visibly relaxed, but his eyes still held a hint of uncertainty. "Why? You could have gone to them, and I wouldn't have blamed you, after everything." Sarah met his gaze, her expression calm but resolute. "Because I'm not like you, Jonathan. I don't walk away from people just because things get tough." Jonathan winced at the words, the weight of her statement hitting him hard. It was true. He had walked away from her all those years ago, without a second thought. And now, in this moment of crisis, she had every right to do the same to him. But she hadn't. She had chosen to stay, to fight for the company he had built, even when she had nothing to gain from it. There was a long pause before Jonathan finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. "I never should have let you go." The admission hung in the air between them, a rare moment of vulnerability from a man who had built his entire life on never showing weakness. For Jonathan, saying those words was harder than any business deal he had ever negotiated. It wasn't just about the past, it was about acknowledging the kind of person he had been and the damage that had caused. Sarah, for her part, wasn't looking for an apology. She had moved past the hurt long ago. But hearing those words from Jonathan, seeing the regret in his eyes, made her realize that he had changed, even if just a little. The man standing before her now wasn't the same man who had fired her all those years ago. He was still flawed, still wrestling with his own demons, but he was different. The conversation that followed was brief, but it marked a turning point. They discussed the next steps for the company, laying out a plan to counter the competitor's aggressive tactics. Sarah's ideas were bold and unorthodox, but Jonathan trusted her judgment. For the first time, they were working together as equals, not as boss and employee. Over the next few weeks, they implemented the plan with precision. It wasn't easy. The competitor was relentless, and the market was volatile. But with Sarah's guidance, Jonathan's company began to turn the tide. Deals were renegotiated, partnerships were strengthened, and the company slowly started to regain its footing. But the real turning point came during a crucial board meeting. The competitor had made one last push to acquire a key asset that would have given them the upper hand. It was a make-or-break moment for Jonathan's company. If they lost the deal, it would spell disaster. But Sarah had anticipated this move, and she had a plan. In the days leading up to the meeting, Sarah worked tirelessly to secure a counteroffer that would outbid the competitor. It was a risky move, but she knew it was their best chance. The day of the meeting arrived, and as Jonathan and Sarah entered the boardroom, the tension was palpable. The room was filled with board members, investors and executives, all waiting to see what would happen next. Jonathan presented the counteroffer with confidence, but everyone knew it was a gamble. The room held its breath as the decision was made. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the board voted in favor of Jonathan's offer. The competitor's acquisition was blocked, and Jonathan's company was saved. As the room erupted in applause, Jonathan turned to Sarah, a look of gratitude in his eyes. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with relief. Sarah smiled, but there was a deeper meaning behind her expression. They had saved the company, yes, but more than that, they had both come full circle. Jonathan had learned that success wasn't just about winning at all costs. It was about the people who stood by you when the stakes were high. For Sarah, this wasn't just a victory in business. It was a victory over her past. She had proven, not just to Jonathan, but to herself, that she was capable of anything. She had built her success on resilience, on never giving up, and now she stood stronger than ever. In the aftermath of the boardroom victory, Jonathan and Sarah's professional relationship had solidified into a partnership that neither of them could have anticipated. They had faced down the competitor together, and the company was now beginning to regain the stability it had lost. But this period of success wasn't just about financial recovery. It became a time of personal growth for both of them, as they confronted the people they once were and the versions of themselves they were striving to become. For Jonathan, the experience of working side by side with Sarah had opened his eyes to a world he had spent years ignoring. He had always been a man driven by success, power, and the bottom line. The idea that people mattered, really mattered, was something he had never truly internalized until now. Watching Sarah navigate complex business deals with a level of empathy and understanding that he had always lacked made him reconsider his approach to leadership. She wasn't just making deals. She was building relationships, fostering trust, and showing him that there was more to business than cold efficiency. Jonathan began to take a step back from his usual hardline tactics. He started to listen more, not just to Sarah, but to his employees, the people who worked for him every day and kept his company running. The boardroom incident had been a wake-up call. For the first time in his life, Jonathan realized that his empire wasn't just built on numbers and profits, it was built on the people who contributed to it. He began scheduling more meetings with employees at all levels, asking for their input, listening to their ideas. He learned to delegate, to trust others with responsibility, something he had always struggled with. It wasn't an easy transition. Jonathan had spent decades believing that power was about control, about making sure every decision came from him. Letting go of that mindset required effort, but Sarah's influence had left a mark. He saw the way she empowered those around her, and how that empowerment created loyalty, innovation, and success. Slowly but surely, Jonathan started to incorporate those lessons into his own leadership style. One afternoon, after a particularly productive meeting with his team, Jonathan sat in his office reflecting on the changes in his life. The weight of responsibility still rested on his shoulders, but it felt different now. It wasn't the crushing burden it had once been. He had built a support system, a network of people who believed in him, not because they feared him, but because they respected him. And that respect, he realized, came not from authority, but from the ability to connect with others. As Jonathan thought about his journey, his mind inevitably returned to Sarah. She had been the catalyst for all of this, though she had never set out to change him. She had simply been herself, and through her actions she had shown him the way forward. But there was something more that Jonathan couldn't quite shake. Over the weeks they had worked together, his feelings for Sarah had evolved beyond admiration. He found himself drawn to her strength, her intelligence, her resilience. She had become more than just a business partner in his eyes. But Jonathan wasn't the only one who had changed. Sarah, too, was in the midst of her own personal transformation. For years, she had carried the weight of her dismissal like a scar. Even after achieving success on her own, There was always a part of her that held on to the memory of being cast aside, of being told she wasn't enough. Working with Jonathan had forced her to confront that pain head-on. It wasn't easy. Seeing him every day, being reminded of the past, had stirred emotions she thought she had long since buried. But as the weeks passed, Sarah began to let go of that old hurt. She saw that Jonathan was no longer the same man who had fired her all those years ago. He had changed, and in a way, that helped her to finally close the chapter on that painful part of her life. Sarah realized that holding on to the past had, in some ways, limited her. It had fueled her drive, yes, but it had also kept her tethered to an old version of herself, one that was defined by what had happened to her rather than by who she had become. Now, standing on equal footing with Jonathan, Sarah found herself free from the need for validation. She had proven herself, not just to him, but to herself. She was no longer driven by the desire to show him what she could do. She was driven by her own goals, her own vision. For the first time in years, Sarah felt a sense of peace, a calmness that came from knowing she had transcended the pain of her past. One evening, after another successful strategy meeting, Sarah and Jonathan found themselves alone in his office. The atmosphere was relaxed, almost casual, a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the room in their earlier encounters. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, looking at Sarah thoughtfully. "You know," he began, his voice softer than usual, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened over the past few months, about how much has changed." Sarah raised an eyebrow, curious. "Changed how?" Jonathan hesitated for a moment before continuing. "When I first asked for your help, I didn't realize what I was really asking for. I thought I needed someone to fix the company, to stop the competitor from taking over, but what I really needed was to fix myself." Sarah was silent, watching him closely. "I never told you this," Jonathan said, his tone sincere, "but firing you was one of the biggest mistakes I've ever made. Not because of what it did to you, though I regret that deeply, but because of what it did to me. I lost someone valuable, someone I should have learned from, and I've been trying to make up for that ever since." Sarah felt a mixture of emotions at his words. Part of her wanted to tell him that it didn't matter anymore, that she had moved on. But another part of her appreciated the vulnerability he was showing. Jonathan, the man who had always been so guarded, so controlled, was opening up in a way she hadn't expected. "You don't owe me anything," Sarah said finally, her voice gentle. "We've both changed. And I think, in a strange way, everything that happened needed to happen for us to be where we are now." Jonathan nodded, but there was still something unsaid, something lingering in the air between them. "I've also realized something else," he added, his voice dropping slightly. "I've realized how much I admire you, Sarah, not just as a businesswoman, but as a person. You've shown me a different way to lead, a different way to live, and I don't think I would have come this far without you." Sarah looked at him, her heart racing slightly. She hadn't expected this turn in the conversation, and she wasn't sure how to respond. But as she met his gaze, she saw the sincerity in his eyes. Jonathan wasn't just talking about business anymore. This was something more. "I appreciate that, Jonathan," she said carefully, "but you've done the work yourself. I just helped point the way." Jonathan smiled, but there was a sadness in his expression. "Maybe. But I think you've become more important to me than I realized." The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment the room was filled with silence. Sarah could feel the shift between them. The professional boundaries that had once defined their relationship were blurring. But was that what she wanted? As Sarah considered her next words, she realized that she had a decision to make. Jonathan had changed. Yes, he had grown, and so had she. But did that mean they should take this new step, cross into something more personal. Before she could speak, Jonathan stood up, breaking the tension. "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly, as if reading her thoughts. "I just wanted you to know how I feel." Sarah stood as well, still processing everything. "I think we both need some time to figure out what's next," she said, her voice calm but steady. "But I'm grateful for everything we've been able to accomplish together." Jonathan nodded, his expression softening. "I agree." As they left the office that night, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The journey they had been on, both personally and professionally, had transformed them in ways neither of them could have predicted. They had both grown, both let go of old wounds, and both found new ways to lead and live. But the question that lingered in the air was whether their growth would bring them closer together or send them down separate paths. For now, only time would tell. The tension between Sarah and Jonathan had been building for weeks. It was a tension that neither of them fully acknowledged, but one that lingered in every conversation, every glance. They had come so far, from the professional distance of employer and employee to equals, partners, and perhaps something more. But as the weight of their shared experiences pressed down on them, a pivotal moment was approaching, a moment that would force them both to confront their feelings, their past, and the path ahead. The night after their last meeting in Jonathan's office, Sarah couldn't sleep. She replayed Jonathan's words in her mind, the sincerity, the vulnerability he had shown when he admitted how much she had impacted his life. But this wasn't just about business anymore. Jonathan had hinted at feelings that went beyond respect or admiration, and that was something Sarah wasn't sure she was ready for. The next day, the company was hosting a high-stakes investor meeting. The competition that had been threatening Jonathan's empire for months was making another aggressive move, and this meeting would determine the future of his business. If they failed to secure the necessary funding, everything they had fought for, everything Sarah had helped rebuild, could collar. Jonathan had called Sarah early that morning to ask her to attend the meeting with him. He had come to rely on her input, her strategic thinking, and her ability to navigate even the most complex situations. But today, there was more at stake than just the business. This was personal for both of them. When Sarah arrived at the meeting, the tension in the room was palpable. Investors sat around a long, polished table, their expressions guarded, their eyes flickering with the kind of shrewd calculation that only comes when millions of dollars are on the line. Jonathan was already there, standing at the head of the table, his usual confident demeanor firmly in place. But when he saw Sarah walk in, a flicker of relief crossed his face. She was his anchor in moments like this. The meeting began, and Jonathan presented the company's position, outlining the challenges they had faced and the aggressive tactics of their competitor. As he spoke, Sarah watched him carefully. He was composed, eloquent, and every bit the leader she knew him to be. But there was an edge to his voice, a subtle tension that betrayed the pressure he was under. As the investors began to ask questions, probing for weaknesses, Sarah stepped in to support Jonathan. She answered their concerns with confidence, explaining the strategies they had implemented to turn the company around and the long-term vision they were working towards. The investors were impressed by her composure, her knowledge, and her ability to navigate the complexities of the business. But the pressure in the room continued to build as the investors remained cautious. Then the moment came. One of the lead investors, an older man with a reputation for being brutally direct, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Jonathan. "We've heard your pitch," he said, his voice calm but sharp. "But here's the thing. Your competitor is offering us a deal that's hard to pass up. They're promising higher returns, faster growth, and fewer risks. Why should we stay with you?" The room fell silent. This was the question Jonathan had been dreading. He had known it would come, but now that it was here, he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He glanced at Sarah, his mind racing for the right response. The future of his company, everything he had worked for, rested on the next few minutes. Before Jonathan could speak, Sarah stepped forward. "I understand your concerns," she began, her voice steady and clear. "Your competitor may be offering short-term gains, but that's all they are, short-term. What Jonathan's company offers is sustainability, a long-term strategy that focuses on steady growth without the volatility that comes with high-risk investments. We've been through challenges before, and we've come out stronger every time. That's because we don't just focus on profits, we focus on people. The reason this company has survived, the reason we're still standing, is because we invest in the relationships we build, not just the bottom line." The investors exchanged glances. Clearly, "Look, I know that numbers are important, and I know that profit margins matter, but what's equally important is trust, and that's something you can't put a price on. The trust we've built with our partners, with our employees, with our clients, that's what makes this company resilient. That's what makes us different." There was a brief pause before she added, "And if you give us your continued support, I can promise you that we'll deliver on that trust. We're not just looking to make a quick profit, we're looking to build something that lasts." The room was silent for a moment. The investors were clearly considering her words. Jonathan stood next to her, his heart racing. He had never heard Sarah speak with such conviction, such passion. She wasn't just fighting for the company, she was fighting for everything they had built together. After what felt like an eternity, the lead investor finally spoke again, his tone more measured than before. "You've given us a lot to think about," he said. "We'll need some time to discuss this." Jonathan nodded, knowing that this was as close to a victory as they were going to get today. The investors needed time to deliberate, but Sarah's words had clearly made an impact. As the meeting came to a close, Jonathan and Sarah stepped out of the conference room, both of them feeling the weight of what had just happened. It wasn't a definitive win, but it wasn't a loss either. They had done everything they could. Now it was up to the investors to decide. They walked in silence for a few moments before Jonathan finally spoke. "You were incredible in there," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Sarah smiled, though her expression was tinged with exhaustion. "It's not over yet. We still have to wait and see what they decide." Jonathan nodded, but there was something else on his mind. Something that had been building for weeks, and now, after everything they had been through, he couldn't hold it back any longer. "Sarah," he began, his voice hesitant, "I need to say something. And I don't know if this is the right time, but I can't keep pretending that everything is just business between us." Sarah stopped walking, turning to face him. There it was, the moment she had been avoiding, the conversation she knew would eventually come, but wasn't sure how to handle. "Jonathan," she started, but he cut her off, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I know this might complicate things, but I need you to know how I feel. Working with you, seeing everything you've done, everything you've become, it's made me realize how much I've taken for granted. You've changed me, Sarah. You've made me a better leader, a better person, and I don't want to lose you, not just in business, but in my life." Sarah's heart raced as she listened to him speak. She had seen this coming, felt the shift between them for weeks, but hearing the words out loud made it real. And that scared her. "I don't know if this is the right time, Jonathan," she said carefully, her voice soft but firm. "There's so much at stake right now, the company, the investors. I'm not sure I can handle everything all at once." Jonathan nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He hadn't expected an answer, but he needed her to know where he stood. He had changed. and he wanted her to see that. "I get it," he said, his voice quiet. I needed to tell you. No matter what happens with the company, no matter what the investors decide, I needed you to know." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, her thoughts racing. She had spent years building walls around herself, protecting her heart from the pain of the past. And now, standing in front of Jonathan, she felt those walls begin to crack. But was she ready to let them fall? Before she could respond, Jonathan's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression immediately shifting to one of urgency. "It's the investors," he said. "They've made their decision." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment that would determine everything. Jonathan answered the call, his face unreadable as he listened to the voice on the other end. Sarah watched him intently, trying to gauge his reaction, but he remained stoic, giving nothing away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jonathan ended the call. "Well?" Sarah asked, her voice tense. Jonathan looked at her, his expression softening into a smile. "They're staying with us. We won." Sarah exhaled, the tension leaving her body in a rush. They had done it. They had saved the company. But as the relief washed over her, she realized that the real victory wasn't just about the business. It was about the growth they had both experienced, the journey they had taken together, from adversaries to allies, and maybe even something more. The news of the investors' decision marked a turning point in both Sarah and Jonathan's lives. The company had been saved, the competitor thwarted, and they had emerged victorious in a battle that had been months in the making. Yet, despite the corporate success, there was an emotional reckoning that both knew could no longer be postponed. As they stood together in the hallway, the weight of everything that had happened settled over them like a fog. The relief of securing the company's future was palpable, but it wasn't enough to ease the tension that remained between them. Jonathan's confession, the unspoken feelings they had both been carrying, hung in the air like an unresolved chord, waiting for its final note. "Jonathan," Sarah began, her voice steady but hesitant, "I think we need to talk." Jonathan's heart raced at her words, but he nodded. He had known this conversation was coming, and now that the pressure of the company's future was no longer hanging over them, there was no reason to avoid it. "Yeah, we do." They walked back to Jonathan's office, the same place where so many of their pivotal moments had taken place over the last few months. The silence between them was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence that came with the weight of everything they had been through, everything they had yet to say. Once inside, Jonathan closed the door behind them. He gestured for Sarah to sit, but she remained standing, pacing slightly as she gathered her thoughts. "Before we get into whatever this is," Sarah started, gesturing between them, "I need to say something about the company, about everything we've been through." Or Jonathan frowned, unsure of where she was going with this. "Okay." Sarah stopped pacing and turned to face him. "I never expected to end up back here. After everything that happened, after the way you fired me, I didn't think I'd ever want to help you again. But these last few months, working with you, seeing how much you've changed, it's made me realize something." Jonathan held his breath, waiting for her to continue. "You've grown, Jonathan. You're not the man you were when you let me go, and I'm not the woman I was back then either. We've both changed, and I think that's why we've been able to accomplish what we have. It wasn't just about saving the company. It was about proving to ourselves that we're capable of more than we thought." Jonathan nodded, understanding the truth in her words. He had grown. He had become a different kind of leader, a different kind of person, and much of that growth was because of Sarah, because she had shown him a different way to lead, a different way to live. "I know I've changed," Jonathan said, his voice quiet but sincere. And I know that a lot of that is because of you." Sarah smiled slightly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I didn't come back here to change you, Jonathan. I came back because I believed in the work we were doing. But somewhere along the way, I realized that I wasn't just working for the company anymore. I was working with you, and that's what made this different." Jonathan swallowed hard, the emotions he had been holding back for so long threatening to spill over. "I feel the same way, Sarah. This isn't just about the company for me either. It hasn't been for a long time." Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair as she tried to organize her thoughts. "But here's the thing, Jonathan. We're standing at a crossroads right now. The company is stable, the crisis is over, and we've proven that we can work together as partners. But I don't know if we can be anything more than that." Jonathan felt a pang of disappointment at her words, but he didn't interrupt. He needed to hear her out. "I don't know if I'm ready for something more," Sarah continued, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "We've been through a lot, and I care about you, but I need time to figure out what that means. For me, for us." Jonathan nodded, though his heart ached at the thought of not moving forward with her. But he respected her honesty. He had always admired her strength, her ability to know what she wanted and to stand firm in her convictions. And if she needed time, he would give her that. "I understand," Jonathan said softly, "and I don't want to push you into anything you're not ready for. I care about you, Sarah, more than I ever thought I would, but I'm willing to wait. I'll give you all the time you need." Sarah smiled, this time a genuine one, and for a moment the tension between them eased. "Thank you, Jonathan. I don't want to rush into something we're not ready for. We've both changed a lot, and I think we need to figure out who we are now before we decide what comes next." Jonathan nodded, though his mind was already spinning with thoughts of what their future could look like. He wanted to be with her, that much was clear. But if she needed time, he would respect that. He wouldn't risk losing her by pushing too hard. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "I think I'm going to take some time off," she said, her voice thoughtful. "I've been running full speed for so long, I need to step back and figure out what I want, what my next move is." Jonathan's heart sank at the thought of her leaving, even temporarily, but he nodded in understanding. "You've earned it. Take all the time you need." Sarah smiled again, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "I'll still be around, Jonathan. I'm not disappearing, but I need to take a break from the company, from everything." Jonathan reached out and gently took her hand, squeezing it lightly. "I'll be here when you're ready." Sarah squeezed his hand back, her eyes softening as she looked at him. "Thank you." With that, Sarah turned and walked toward the door, pausing just before she opened it. She looked back at Jonathan, her expression thoughtful. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Jonathan smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, we have." Sarah gave him one last look before she stepped out of the office, leaving Jonathan standing alone. He watched her go, the ache in his chest growing stronger with every step she took. He didn't know when she would return, or if she would ever be ready to take their relationship to the next level. But he knew one thing for certain. He would wait for her, for as long as it took. The following weeks passed slowly for Jonathan. Without the crisis to keep him occupied, he found himself with more time to reflect on everything that had happened. The company was stable, the investors were satisfied, and the competitor had backed off, at least for the time being. But despite the professional success, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that had settled over him. He missed Sarah. Not just her presence in the office, but the way she challenged him, the way she made him see the world differently. He had come to rely on her, not just as a business partner, but as a friend. And now that she was gone, even temporarily, He felt lost. But Jonathan wasn't the only one grappling with his feelings. Sarah, too, found herself struggling to reconcile her emotions. She had taken time off to clear her head, to figure out what she wanted, but the more time she spent away from Jonathan, the more she realized how much she missed him. She missed their conversations, their shared victories, the way he had grown into someone she respected and admired. It was during one of her long walks along the beach, a place where she often went to clear her mind, that she came to a realization. She cared about Jonathan deeply, but her fear of repeating the past, of getting hurt again, had held her back. She had spent so long building walls around her heart that she hadn't allowed herself to fully trust him. But Jonathan wasn't the same man who had fired her all those years ago. He had changed, and so had she. With that realization, Sarah made a decision. It was time to stop running from her feelings. It was time to face them head on. 2 weeks later, Jonathan was sitting in his office, reviewing some reports when there was a knock on the door. He looked up, surprised to see Sarah standing there. She looked different, more relaxed, more at peace with herself. "Sarah," he said, standing up quickly, "I didn't expect to see you." Sarah smiled, stepping into the office and closing the door behind her. "I've been doing a lot of thinking." Jonathan's heart raced as he waited for her to continue. "And I've realized something," she said, her voice steady. "I don't want to keep running from this, from us. I care about you, Jonathan, and I think I'm ready to see where this goes." Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as her words sank in. "Are you sure?" Sarah nodded, her smile widening. "Yeah, I'm sure." Jonathan crossed the room in 2 strides, pulling her into a tight embrace. For the first time in months, the weight that had been pressing down on him lifted. He didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he knew one thing for certain: they were going to face it together. Months passed, and life for both Jonathan and Sarah began to settle into a new rhythm. The company continued to flourish, thanks to the solid foundation they had rebuilt together. Investors were happy, the competition had been staved off, and Jonathan's reputation as a forward-thinking leader was solidified. But beyond the professional success, something deeper had shifted in both their lives. The journey they had undertaken together had transformed them, not just as business people, but as individuals. And now they were finally ready to explore what the future held. Jonathan stood on the balcony of his penthouse one early morning, watching the sun rise over the city skyline. The air was crisp, the sky tinged with the soft hues of dawn. It was a quiet moment, one that allowed him to reflect on everything that had happened. He couldn't remember the last time he had taken the time to just stand still, to appreciate the world around him. His life had always been about the next deal, the next achievement. But now, for the first time in years, he felt at peace. A soft knock on the balcony door pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Sarah, wrapped in a cozy sweater, her hair tousled from sleep. She smiled at him, the kind of smile that made his heart skip a beat every time. It was a smile he had come to cherish. "Morning," she said, stepping out onto the balcony and joining him by the railing. "Morning," he replied, his voice soft. "You're up early." Sarah shrugged, leaning against the railing and looking out at the city. "Couldn't sleep, too much on my mind." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Good things, I hope." Sarah smiled, nodding. "Yeah, good things." They stood in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the city come to life below them. It was a far cry from the high-stakes meetings and boardroom battles that had once defined their relationship. Now they shared quiet moments like this, moments where the world seemed to pause, just for them. "You've changed, you know," Sarah said suddenly, her voice thoughtful. Jonathan glanced at her, curious. "How so?" "You're more present," she explained. Less focused on what's next, more focused on what's now. Jonathan chuckled, nodding in agreement. I guess you're right. You're to thank for that. Sarah shook her head. You did the work, Jonathan. I just showed you that there was another way. Jonathan reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. Still, I wouldn't be here without you. Sarah smiled, but didn't say anything. She didn't need to. They both knew how far they had come, both individually and together. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. As the morning sun continued to rise, Jonathan's mind wandered to the future. He had always been someone who planned ahead, who mapped out every detail of his life. But with Sarah, the future felt less like something to control and more like something to experience. He didn't know exactly what lay ahead for them, but for the first time, he was okay with that. The months following their emotional confession had been a time of exploration for both of them. They had agreed to take things slowly, to not rush into anything they weren't ready for. Jonathan had given Sarah the space she needed, and in return, she had opened up to him in ways he hadn't expected. Their relationship grew, not out of necessity or circumstance, but out of mutual respect, admiration, and a deep, unspoken connection that had been forged through years of growth and hardship. They weren't just partners in business anymore. They were partners in life. 2 years later, Sarah found herself walking down a familiar street. The sounds of the city buzzed around her, but she barely noticed. Her mind was focused on where she was headed, back to the building where it had all started, the building where Jonathan had fired her so many years ago. But this time, she wasn't walking in as an employee. She wasn't the same woman who had once walked out of those glass doors feeling defeated and lost. This time, she was returning as a partner, both in business and in life. Jonathan had asked her to meet him at the office to discuss a new venture they were launching together. It was an initiative that combined both their strengths, Jonathan's business acumen and Sarah's vision for social impact. They had spent months planning it, and today was the day they would finally make it official. As Sarah approached the building, she couldn't help but smile at the irony. The place that had once represented her greatest failure was now the starting point for a new chapter in her life, a chapter she was excited to write. She stepped into the lobby, the familiar scent of polished floors and fresh coffee greeting her as she made her way to the elevators. The ride up to Jonathan's office felt surreal. So much had changed since the last time she had stood in that elevator, feeling like her world was falling apart. Now she felt empowered, confident, and ready for whatever lay ahead. When she arrived at Jonathan's office, he was already waiting for her. He stood by the large windows, looking out at the city below, just as he had done so many times before. But when he turned to greet her, there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there in the past, a softness that came from a man who had learned to let go of the past and embrace the future. "You're here," Jonathan said, smiling as she walked in. "I'm here," Sarah replied, returning his smile. They sat down together, going over the final details of their new venture. It was an ambitious project, one that would not only generate profits, but also create opportunities for underprivileged communities. It was something they both believed in, something they both wanted to leave as their legacy. As they worked, their conversation shifted from business to life, their life. They talked about their future, about the home they were building together, about the trips they wanted to take, and the dreams they had yet to fulfill. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt like he was truly living, not just existing in a world of deals and profits, but living a life filled with purpose, connection, and love. At the end of the day, as the sun began to set, Jonathan looked at Sarah and smiled. "You know, I never thought I'd be here, sitting in this office with you, planning our future." Sarah laughed softly. "Neither did I. But I'm glad we are." Jonathan reached across the table, taking her hand in his. We've come a long way. Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with emotion. We have. They sat in silence for a moment, savoring the quiet, the peace that came with knowing they had overcome so much to get to this point. The future was uncertain, as it always was, but they no longer feared it. Together they were ready to face whatever came next. A few months later, Jonathan and Sarah stood at the grand opening of their new venture. The building was filled with people, investors, partners, and community members, all gathered to celebrate the beginning of something new. It was a project that combined everything they had learned over the years, everything they had built, and everything they wanted to give back to the world. As Jonathan took the stage to give his opening remarks, he looked out at the crowd and then back at Sarah, who stood beside him. She smiled at him, and in that moment, he felt a surge of gratitude for everything they had been through. "Thank you all for being here today," Jonathan began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Today isn't just about launching a new venture. It's about celebrating growth, resilience, and the power of partnership." He paused, his eyes locking with Sarah's. "I've learned a lot over the years, both in business and in life. But the most important lesson I've learned is that success isn't just about what you achieve. It's about who you have by your side when you achieve it. And I'm incredibly grateful to have Sarah by my side, not just as my partner in this project, but as my partner in life." The crowd applauded, but for Jonathan and Sarah, the moment was about more than just the applause. It was a moment of closure, a moment of realization that they had finally come full circle. The journey that had begun with pain and loss had led them to a place of love, growth, and endless possibility. As they stood together, hand in hand, watching the future unfold before them, they knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Before you go, don't miss out on more incredible stories. Click on the playlist that's popping up on your screen right now. It's packed with some of the best stories you'll ever find on YouTube. Trust me, these tales are even more thrilling, emotional, and surprising than the one you just watched. Go ahead and click. You won't want to miss what's next.